Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you could join us. In the early hours of September 10th, Polish authorities detected 19 drones inside Poland, some of which were shot down in a joint operation by Polish and NATO air forces. As a precaution, authorities suspended flights at several airports and instructed residents in regions bordering Belarus and Ukraine to remain indoors and exercise caution. While Poland and other NATO members on the eastern flank, especially Romania, have previously experienced Russian drones violating their airspace, this incident represents a major escalation. Poland triggered Article 4, which requires consultations among allies when the security of one member is threatened. The large number of Russian drones that violated Polish airspace suggests that this was likely an intentional Russian effort. We'll delve into Russia's motivations in today's episode, but at a minimum, it's an attempt to get Europeans to back down from their efforts to forge ahead with security guarantees for Ukraine and limit military aid to Kyiv. And it's a further step in Putin's effort to undermine NATO credibility, to expose the alliance as a paper tiger. Even more, the attack provided the Kremlin with key insights into Poland and NATO's air defenses and its chain of response, all valuable information in any future aggression targeting the alliance. So how do we understand what happened and what needs to happen? And to answer those very hard questions, we're very fortunate to have with us Kurt Volker and Doug Lute. Kurt, Doug, welcome back to Brussels Sprouts.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Andy.
Same here.
Quick intros. Ambassador Doug Lute served as the U.S. ambassador to NATO from 2013 to 2017, and Ambassador Kurt Volker also served as the U.S. ambassador to NATO from 2008 to 2009, and as the U.S. special representative for Ukraine negotiations from 2017 to 2019, and he's joining us from Kyiv for this recording. So I don't know, I was trying to figure out where to start, and I was kind of reflecting on my own response. I think on the one hand, I was surprised by the news at the brazenness of the actions taken by the Russians. But on the other hand, not at all surprised, because I think we've all been warning that things like this could happen, that there was a risk that the war could widen, that Russia's ambitions don't end in Ukraine. And so maybe just as a very kind of opening question to hear from both of you how you responded to the news. Kurt, you were in Ukraine. Maybe let's start with you.
Yeah, so I was in Ukraine on the night that happened. I was in Ukraine and Odessa a few nights before that when Russia launched over 800 missiles and drones in its largest overnight attack on Ukraine ever. And you could hear the loud explosions outside our hotel room windows in Odessa. So Russia's doing this all the time. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I'm not at all surprised that Russia would do something like this, to send drones into Poland and see what we do, to test us. And that's part of the message, see how we react. And then the other part of the message is to try to intimidate us, because they're trying to say, unless you pressure Ukraine to give up territory that we Russians don't currently occupy, you run a risk of this war coming to you. And so I think it was both a message of intimidation as well as a test. Not at all surprised that Russia would do that. That's the kind of thing they do. What's interesting is that they did it now, which is an indicator to me that Putin thinks his position is worse than it appears on the surface, and he wants to maximize the gains that he can get while he still can. I think he knows his clock is ticking, and this is an effort to show strength when he knows his position is weakened.
Well, I think it's important we start, as you have, Andrea, with the context, right? Because there is a broader strategic and maybe operational context here. And the strategic context is the one you've laid out. So at least 6 months or 8 months of increasing Russian air attacks against Ukraine at record levels, as Kurt cited the other night, with some 800 air vehicles violating Ukrainian airspace and attacking largely civilian Ukrainian targets. No progress on the diplomatic front. Repeated deadlines set by the US administration that have come and gone without effective action. And basically, I think Putin has concluded that he doesn't really suffer any risk of increased pressure, either diplomatic, economic, or military, from the US. So to some extent, he's riding high here. And his international isolation has been largely set aside by way of first the Alaska visit or the Alaska summit, but then more recently last week with a series of events in China. So he's actually doing pretty well based on just the last several months worth of progress. Also on the operational front, there's a large Zapad exercise, Belarus, Russian bilateral exercise, military exercise taking place in Belarus. And that may have had some impact on why some of these drones actually came from Belarus and so forth. But that's obviously another important signal of strength that that despite the long slog and largely stalemate in Ukraine, that Russia retains the capacity to host this large exercise with its nearest and closest partner, Belarus. So I think the context is important, and we'll see. What remains a question, though, is what was the real intent here? I agree that it looks like this was a probing attack, or this was an exploration, an attempt to try to scope out the Polish and NATO responses. But I think as evidence comes in, more will become clear. We haven't done the forensics yet, all the forensics yet on the attack.
Yep, it was one of my questions. I mean, you've both sat in the seats at NATO HQ and, put yourselves back in that position. How important is the attribution? How important is it to understand intent? But then what are the associated risks or the trade-off that we go, down this rabbit hole and kind of get stuck on attribution and paralyzed and aren't able to, in a timely manner, respond adequately? Like, when you're sitting in that seat, how do you weigh the trade-offs between attribution and understanding intentionality versus forging ahead with a clear and demonstrative response?
Well, I don't think attribution is a problem here. These are Russian drones. They've been identified. They've been picked up off the ground in Poland.
I guess intentionality, I think, is the
other issue. Yeah, so attribution is not the problem.
Yeah.
When we had the cyber attacks against Estonia, there was an attribution issue because, well, was it the Russian government? Was it hackers? Were they hackers in Russia or using Russia? So they were able to hide behind a lot of shadows in that. There's no shadows here. This is a Russian set of drones that flew into Poland and got shot down. Now, intentionality is what you're asking, which is, did they intend to send these drones into Poland? My view is 100% yes. The number and the depth to which they went into Poland are already indicators that it was intentional. And moreover, the fact that they were unarmed, which is what the Poles later discovered, also indicates to me intentionality. If these were drones that were aimed at just clipping Polish airspace and firing at something in Ukraine, they would have been armed. But the fact that they weren't armed means that they didn't really want to attack something in Poland, which is what Peskov said, by the way. They didn't want to attack something in Poland. They just wanted to send them into Poland and see what happens. And Andrea, if I could just take one more sentence here. When we talk about testing the NATO response, and Doug mentioned that as well, one part of the NATO response is, what do you do while they're flying? Do you shoot them down? Do you actually recognize that this is an enemy target that you have to shoot down? And we did, to pass that test. The second thing, however, is, what is the policy conclusion that you draw from this? And what do you do going forward so that this doesn't happen again? And it's clear to Russia that this cannot happen again. And there we are still waiting. We have not seen anything out of NATO along those lines yet.
Yeah. So Doug, pick up on that. I mean, so coming back to this intentionality piece, my understanding is from kind of the Article 4 consultations that was significantly dominated by discussions of intentionality and kind of, so it's a really hard question is, how do we weigh the decisive action demonstrating resolve, political resolve to respond versus risking allies really hemming and high, not hemming on high, I don't mean to belittle it, but really getting bogged down in trying to get to the bottom of this intentionality question.
This is one reason why the Article 4 session of the North Atlantic Council at the ambassadors level was so important just yesterday, right? Because it gave Poland, the target of this attack, right? It gave Poland an opportunity to lay out the facts, and they will have laid out the tracks, the flight tracks of the drones. They will have laid out the timelines. They may have known at the time of the Article 4 session yesterday, your mention that these were unarmed and so forth. But it's important in a consensus-based decision-making body like NATO that you bring everybody along with the facts. What's clear is that this is not a hybrid attack. This isn't a shadowy, questionable attribution, cyber attack, little green men. This is not. It's quite bold. It's quite overt, and there's no question, as Kurt said, there's no question where these drones came from, and we have the physical evidence. So, unlike, for example, the 2014 seizing of Crimea and all that, right? When there was debate in the council about who did this, and is this really sort of a popular uprising, or what's going on in the Donbass? Are these legitimate separatist movements? And so there's none of that. This is not cloudy. This is crystal clear. So I think the point that Kurt made about, okay, now what? So NATO passed the first test. It passed it in the form of detecting these attacks, this incursion, right? Responding to the incursion, triggering Article 4, but now what? And that's a really difficult question because defense against drones, we haven't solved that as an alliance. We certainly haven't solved that question of asymmetric air attacks as a country. And we haven't solved it. We haven't solved it anywhere, not in Ukraine, but not in the Red Sea, not in Iranian attacks on Israel or in any other context. And so we have this looming question, this looming military question about how do you contend with floods of cheap, inexpensive drones against which our defense are high-end, very expensive systems like F-16s firing air-to-air missiles, or God forbid, Patriot missiles at $1 million a copy, shooting down $10,000 drones. I mean,
which
we're
happened
stuck.
in Poland. Which
Right.
happened. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're stuck in this asymmetric fight, and I think maybe part of the message of this drone episode is to remind NATO that it's vulnerable, and it's vulnerable along the entire eastern flank to these sort of asymmetric attacks.
Well, thank you, guys. I agree with everything that you've said, and thank you also for being on the show. But along these lines, one of the reasons that we wanted to have this podcast is we have a feeling that particularly after the Charlie Kirk assassination, which was a horrible tragedy, that the magnitude of this issue, the importance of this issue of what next is going to be, it's not going to be understood, or it's going to be lost among people who need to understand that this is something that's not just a one-off kind of thing. This is not something that we can just dismiss, and it's just 19 drones and it's Poland and it's way over there and we got other things going on. That in fact, this is something that we've got to really pay attention to. That this is an escalation, and this is an event that's got to be appropriately handled and appropriately understood across the alliance. Not just the vulnerability, which is absolutely right, but politically, we have to respond in the right way. And if we don't, that's going to have major implications for the future. At least that's what I'm seeing. And so, given that gravity of where we are and the importance that everyone outside our little group of NATO dicks understands what we're having to deal with, what do you think the next step, not militarily, because Doug, you're absolutely right about the military point, and adding to that, I think they only shot down 3 of the 19. Wasn't that the scoreboard? Wasn't 3 of the 19?
Nine.
9 of the 19?
And but some crashed on their own volition, right? And some, to your point, Kurt, some of these really penetrated quite deeply into Poland.
Yes.
Yeah. So the question is, again, back to what Andrea said, we're sitting there at U.S. Mission NATO, and we're trying to figure out, what's the appropriate response? I saw Whitaker's, if you read Twitter, I just was just dumped all over it. What he said early on, the SecGen wasn't much better. A lot of boilerplate language. Trump. Trump. I did a lot of media yesterday. Every question start off with, what does Trump mean by here we go? And it's like, well, so here we go, guys. Here we go.
All right.
So what do we what do we do? And what's the appropriate response, proportionate response that NATO needs to do to put the Russians on notice? So what is it? What do we do?
Right. So let me jump in on that, because I've written about this. I've done interviews on this earlier today. Look, we cannot defend NATO populations within NATO territory. That's too late. You don't wait for the attack to already be inside the country. So NATO should be declaring an extended air defense zone, saying, look, we're going to look out 200 kilometers or 150, whatever the right range is. Say, any foreign, unfriendly objects flying in that area, we will try to take down. We NATO can only do this if we are integrated and cooperating with our Ukrainian partners, so that we now will not allow drones, missiles, etc., flying in that zone, because it is a threat to our populations. If we wait till they're already inside Poland, it's too late. People could be killed. NATO populations could be killed. So we will declare an extended air defense zone over a region, 150 kilometers, 200 kilometers out, to say we don't accept anything in that zone. And Putin brought this on by this deliberate incursion into Polish airspace. And if people were to say that, oh, this is an escalation, this is now risking NATO-Russia war, this is now creating a conflict between NATO and Russia, baloney. Those Russian drones and missiles have no business being in that airspace. It is not theirs. It is Ukraine. It is something else. So no way. We will not allow those sorts of objects flying.
And this is not without precedent. I mean, there's even a terrible acronym, ADIZ, right? ADIZ, Air Defense Interdiction Zones, which is the technical term for what Kurt just described. And this is an extension of your air defense responsibilities beyond your physical land border.
Which we have, U.S. has off Alaska.
Of course. Yeah. This is why we scramble fighters off of Alaska when beyond that zone, we detect Russian bear bombers or something like that, right? So this is not unusual. The other thing, I think you have to couple that increased defensive posture with a willingness to position deep strike systems that are within range of the launch sites of such attacks. And this, of course, has been a longstanding challenge in the Ukrainian context. And eventually now at the 3-year mark, Ukraine's increasingly building its own long-range strike systems because we've trained them not to depend on us to reliably provide quantity, quality, and authorities for use of our long-range systems to strike Russian launch sites. Well, imagine if NATO positioned such long-range systems along its eastern front. And again, it doesn't mean we're threatening anything other than the defense of our territory. And I'd like to see the potential of the basing of Tomahawk systems. So that's 1,500 miles. That's a long reach. And that's the sort of thing that will get Putin's attention.
So there does seem to be, Kurt, lots of people are, putting forward this idea. I think a lot of people agree with you about the need to extend air defenses, including into Ukraine. So, how do you think that will be received within NATO? Is that something, again, where you think that we could get consensus to do, or are we going to once again resort to these coalitions of the willing where only some groups of countries are willing to take more of these countries? I mean, you highlighted some of the pushback and the risks associated with taking that step, but how much appetite are you sensing within NATO to consider something like that?
Yeah. Well, as Doug had pointed out, NATO is a collection of lots of countries with very different views, and you need to bring everybody along. It really boils down to where the U.S. is.
Right.
You have the Nordics, the Baltics, Central and East Europeans, UK, France, Germany. Those people will be fine with an extended air defense zone. You have others, Hungary, Slovakia, Greece, Spain, Belgium, cautious about something like that. And you could end up with a coalition of the willing to say, okay, we're going to do this. But even then, you end up with a coalition of the willing to take a step like that if they know they have U.S. backing. If you don't have U.S. backing, everyone's going to be cautious because you don't want to get out on a limb. If the U.S. is advocating, as Jim said, go back to the Obama or the Biden playbook, which is don't escalate, avoid a direct NATO-Russia conflict, don't get dragged into nuclear war, de-escalate, find off-ramps. If that's the playbook we go to, then NATO will do nothing.
But I do think it's possible to imagine the steps we've outlined taken on a national basis by several NATO frontline states. So in particular, perhaps Poland and Romania, for example, or Finland, the Baltics, Poland and Romania, right? And on a national basis, perhaps fed by NATO early warning systems, taking these national decisions to extend their air defense systems to the east. I mean, you got to wonder about the internal domestic politics in Poland if they don't do something like that. What are they? Is Poland just going to become the catcher's mitt for every such episode? I mean, that doesn't seem to be sustainable in the Polish political scene. And of course, Polish politics are divided as it is anyway, between the prime minister and the presidency. So this could be a contest inside Polish politics, domestic political politics, that will first answer this question that we're addressing, which is, okay, what's next? And then that move may well, in turn, over time, lead to a broader NATO effect. But I think Poland's going to be, they must do something beyond simply Article 4, the Article 4 meeting yesterday.
Absolutely, and I think also NATO must do something too as well. A couple things real quick. One is, it almost sounds like Baltic air policing on a larger scale, but NATO has done this before. You get a rotation going, but it's a huge huge amount of air to cover.
But the difference here, Jim, of course, is Baltic air policing is largely extending the air defense zone, as we discussed, but into international airspace.
Yeah.
Right, beyond national borders over the Baltic Sea.
Yeah.
And not across national land boundaries to the east.
Yep, and also this is talking about potentially shooting something down, whereas Baltic air policing wasn't, at least in the past, wasn't quite as kinetic as that. But let me raise something else with you real quick. You mentioned Doug Zapad, and I think this is something that people haven't cottoned on to quite yet, that Zapad, in a situation like this, the Zapads that were before the invasion were to really showcase to the West that this was a different Russian military, that this was something we had improved ourselves since the Georgia invasion, and this is what we can do. Well, now they're in the midst of this fight, and they don't have a whole lot to showcase. But the Zapad event itself, I mean, as we remember with Crimea, they used Zapad, they used a exercise to mask what they were getting ready to do in Crimea. And so these Zapads can be really tricky. And I'm wondering, you have you have the Zapad going on just right now after the Polish drones situation. But you also have this escalating rhetoric towards Finland. which I've really noticed is getting quite blunt and quite threatening. I don't know if you all have been reading it. I'm not saying that there's an imminent military attack or even drones over Finland, but there seems to be this doesn't seem to be a one-off kind of thing. This seems with the Polish drones. This seems to be a lot of things suddenly happening. You've got Zapad, you've got the Polish thing, you've got this escalation in rhetoric against Finland. What do you think is going on? Can you connect those dots into something that there is an escalation in terms of just the bullying that Putin does? Is he prepping the battlefield for something, if you will, or what is this? Or are these three separate things that are just coincidental in terms of happening at the same time?
Well, it's interesting that some proportion of the 19 drones violated the Polish border with Belarus.
Right.
Right, where the Zapad exercises are taking place, not only the Polish border with Ukraine, which you might expect more, more logically. So maybe that's part of the messaging. Look, you're right. This Zapad exercise isn't going to be anything like the scale of previous ones. Why? Because the Russian army is
It's smaller.
engaged and it's much smaller,
Yeah.
and it's fully engaged. It's fighting for its life in the Donbass largely. So that makes it mostly a demonstration, I think. And I think the basic message is, look, we still have the capacity to do more than Ukraine. Now, I don't think there'll be a lot of public, shows of that demonstration. It's going to be pretty modest, by my guess, especially compared to historical precedents. But I think the basic message is, look, we still have the capacity to do more than Ukraine.
But I
Yeah.
think there's a point. There's a point, I mean, that you both have already hit on, which is like the permissiveness of the environment. And so you both talked about the Alaska summit and the meetings in Beijing and in China. And I think Putin understands that President Trump doesn't want confrontation, and the imperative is to de-escalate. And so, I think the expectation is he's going to push the envelope, knowing that the United States in particular is going to say, just de-escalate, just de-escalate. And so, he'll keep pushing the envelope to see what he can get away with, testing, probing how far it is, create a new basis, a new normal, continue to intimidate European publics. The leaders, look what's happening in France with the government there, the Germans, the UK, these leaders aren't popular. And so I think he really senses, Putin, an opportunity to intimidate publics along the lines that you have both said, to try to, and right at a time when the coalition of the willing is really gearing up to try to prepare to put forces into Ukraine to provide a security guarantee. And I think this is a big reminder that Putin is trying to demonstrate that, if you think, if I'm willing to do this in Poland, I won't hesitate to use force in Ukraine if there's Europeans on the ground there. So to me, I mean, that it's a lot about that. And I mean, we all understand he wants to undermine NATO. And so he's going to try to do it through these political means first, without his preference is not to have to use military force. And so you just keep pushing to see if you can accomplish the undermining of NATO through non-military means. And if all else fails, then you eventually get to a point where he might consider military. But I don't know, Kurt, what's your response?
Well, I think I agree with you to a certain degree. I think he does perceive weakness, passivity, desire to de-escalate in the West, desire to avoid confrontation in the West. I think you're right. He does see that. So he certainly plays to that. But I also think that the loud statements, the demonstrativeness is meant to cover up for what is an underlying weakness. And I think he knows that too. Like as Doug was saying, the Zapad exercise is a fizzle. So how better to cover for this fizzle than by doing something dramatic like sending drones into Poland? You get everybody talking about something else and not about Russia's weakness. So I think it's a combination of those two things.
Well, it's also interesting if you look carefully at the photos from China, right? You see Lukashenko sort of looming in the second or third row of luminaries, and is sort of right out of central casting, right out of Soviet central casting figure. And so he was there, Lukashenko was there, and you see a Trump deputy envoy in Minsk with the promise of relieving sanctions, U.S. sanctions on Belarus because of prisoner exchange, detainee exchanges, and so forth, right? And even the hint today in the press, in open source reporting, that we would be open to reopening our embassy in Belarus. So, I mean, this is all good news for Vladimir Putin. I mean, this is starting with Alaska. I would argue starting with the election of Donald Trump, but certainly by way of Alaska and then last week in China, this is all moving in his direction. And his National Security Council meetings these days are good news events.
Kurt, to the extent that you picked up in discussions today, what was the response in Kyiv?
So people in Kyiv are saying, yeah, like, we know. Yeah, Russia attacks us every day.
Only 19? They're saying
only
19 drones.
Yeah,
Come on.
Is there the hope that this is yet another wake-up call for NATO and the West to step up support, or is there worry? I mean, Putin's objective is obviously to get Poles and others to say, well, we can't send our weapons over there. Look, we are insecure right at home, so we got to keep our... Is there a concern that it precipitates that kind of response?
Actually, I would say the predominant response is cynicism. That, when Donald Tusk comes out and says this was a huge drone invasion, use the word huge, 19 drones that are unarmed for Ukrainians is not huge. And so they view this quite cynically. They hope that NATO would actually show some strength, but they are very skeptical that NATO will.
And
we've produced that skepticism. I mean, we should look in the mirror here, right? This goes back beyond this administration into the Biden administration. We've trained them not to trust us, and we've trained them to be cynical and question our long-term sustainability. And at the 3-year mark, they got it.
I think I was reading today in press that the Poles will send some of their military to Ukraine to start training in drone tactics. I mean, to what extent do you think that that this is an opportunity for Ukrainians again to reaffirm their value as critical security partners for NATO? I mean, they're learning in real time. Is there an opportunity? I mean, especially for Europeans who are pretty, skeptical about the reliability of the United States as a partner. To what extent do you think Ukraine really begins to step up and show their value and remind NATO of all of the lessons they have to teach about fighting Russia and in modern warfare?
Yeah, so Ukraine has the largest, most experienced, and best trained military in Europe right now. And so they know that, and I think our European allies know that as well. What Ukraine has, we talk about drones and drone warfare and tactics and all that. It's not the objects, it's not the drones. It is the thought process. It's the integration of evolving technology on the battlefield against an adversary that also has evolving technology on the battlefield. That is a mental state and a mental process that we simply do not have. And that, I think, is very wise of Poland to send people to Ukraine to get into that understanding. How does this really work? So I think that's good for Ukraine. I don't believe the rest of NATO really understands yet what they are lacking. And yes, Ukraine has tremendous value, but Ukraine is not interested in being value to NATO so much as they are interested in winning the war. They have to stop Russia. And I think that, again, I hate to use the word cynicism again, but they look at NATO and Western Europe, the United States, as a bit complacent. Having all this high-end, highly expensive stuff and not having a battlefield mentality and not able to do much with it.
Right.
One very meaningful step that could come from this episode is a reprioritization among the defense industrial base players in Europe. to include the European Union, and it has certain investment programs underway and so forth that prioritize the defense against this kind of drone attack. And we've got a long way to go to catch up with what Ukraine has learned on the battlefield. But we've also got to invest in systems which are not the $1 million Patriot missiles or an F-35 fifth generation stealth fighter firing an AMRAAM against a $10,000 drone. And so we could shift gears in the emerging investment programs especially in the European defense industrial base, to great effect, because it's pretty clear where we're vulnerable.
It is really remarkable. I mean, again, yeah, I'm outside of government in the cheap seats out here, but we've all recognized the evolution of warfare, the great utilization by both Russia and Ukraine in drone warfare. And I think everyone is recognized, that things are changing, but yet NATO still seems to have been quite slow at actually taking steps to do the learning and do all the investments, Doug, that you're talking about. So, I mean, it's you wonder how many wake up calls it takes, but I agree, like maybe this is a silver lining of this episode, is that it kind of jolts people into greater urgency with which they need to start adopting these new approaches.
Let me ask. We haven't really talked too much about the U.S. response to this. We've gotten one tweet out of Donald Trump on Truth Social, and we've heard a little bit from J.D. Vance about the importance, as I remember hearing, the importance of the Russian economy and buying their oil. It's something that was a little bit of a crazy interview that was a day or two ago. And now, of course, the Charlie Kirk situation has just totally dominated thinking in the White House and across the country, quite frankly. What should the U.S. response be now? I mean, time has moved on. This is off the front pages. It probably didn't grab people's attention, as I said earlier, like it did us. But the U.S. has still got to respond. And if there's going to be a no-fly zone or an air defense interdiction zone or anything like that we lead NATO to do, we've got to lead. We've got to lead. We've got to do more than what Whitaker said at NATO. So what's the next move as time is going by and it's becoming more and more awkward? How can the U.S. lead in this? What should we be doing now?
Kurt has cautiously used the term cynicism with regard to his take from our Ukrainian partners. That cynicism extends to our key NATO allies. I don't think they expect anything in this administration. And part of the strategic context that we laid out up front is that America is increasingly self-absorbed with our own domestic politics. I mean, yes, it's Charlie Kirk and his assassination, his murder, but it's beyond that. We got a National Guardsman on the streets of American cities. We've got basically untethered counter immigration or the response to immigration. We've got problems at home that suggest that we're not really paying much attention, and we don't have the bandwidth to attend to things like this 19 drone incursion, or frankly, the Israeli strike in Doha, Qatar. Right. Or any number of other things that are going on around the world. So there's a reason all these things are happening coincidentally, right? And part of the logic is that the U.S. is self-absorbed domestically.
Yeah, I think Doug's right on that. As to your question, Jim, as to what we should do, whether or not we will do it is, governed by what Doug just said. But what we should do, we should recognize that what we are seeing globally is the result of a collapse of deterrence. No one is afraid. No one is worried about the United States bringing to bear the capability that we possess and the will to use that capability to make their lives unsustainable if they do something we don't want them to do. They are not worried about that. So what we need to do is to reestablish dominance in order to have deterrence. so that people are indeed concerned that they can't get away with things. That is not the mentality that the US is projecting in the world right now. We are, and for years, I should say, for a decade or more, we've been projecting a mentality. We want the rest of the world to go away. We're doing too much. We want to pull back. We want to get out of this. So if that's our mentality, the rest of the world takes advantage of that. And that's what we've seen absolutely everywhere: Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, Taliban, Cuba, Venezuela, you name it. That is the world that we're living in. So we have to actually step up in order to establish a stable situation so that we can deal with domestic issues or other things that we care about. But right now, our situation's eroding around us because of the lack of U.S. commitment.
And it seems, if the reports are correct, that the national defense strategy, which is about to emerge publicly, right, will just codify what Kurt just said, which is, look, we're basically going to work on a homeland. We've got work to do here at home. Beyond the homeland, we're concerned with the Western Hemisphere, and the rest of the world. It's time for you to pay attention to yourselves and solve your own problems. It's also curious that we're about to get a national defense strategy that outlines, as I just said, given that we've renamed the Department of Defense the Department of War, and given that we don't yet have a national security strategy, which is supposed to be, supposed to be this cascading effect of national security strategy, defense strategy, then ultimately military strategy, and somehow we're plugging in the middle, coincidental with the renaming of the Department of Defense, the National Defense Strategy, which essentially has us, if reports are correct, focusing on the Western Hemisphere.
On the posture review national defense strategy, I mean, I don't know to what extent are you still hearing that you think it is going to be kind of a more sizable withdrawal of U.S. presence in Europe? Because I talked to some kind of embassies in town, and I think there's still some cautious optimism that it won't be as bad as people hoped. Certainly, President Trump had a positive meeting with the Poles and reaffirmed the importance of at least that relationship. So I don't know, and I just, any tidbits that you're picking up on what to expect?
Look, I don't honestly. I too have been trained. Okay, I don't honestly believe anything that is said on day one will have will extend into meaning something on days 2, 3, and 4 afterwards. And so, yes, there was a positive visit by the Polish newly elected Polish president with President Trump, and yes, there are some 10,000 American troops on a rotational basis based in Poland, but I don't think that has any connection to what might come out of the force posture review. And I think most vulnerable from a European perspective are those rotational troops. They're the easiest ones to sort of turn on and turn off.
Yeah, I think, Andrea, what I keep expecting here, and maybe I'm naive and traditionalist, but what I expect is a national defense strategy is going to have a set of missions defined, and then you're going to size forces against those missions. The missions right now are still fairly high end. They're still fairly aggressive because we have a raging war in Europe and a need to protect ourselves, to do what we're required to do for allies, to establish presence and deter potential Russian attacks against allies. So I think what you may see is a refining of what the missions are, not much movement on the force posture in the short run, with a goal of having a reduced force posture down the road, provided we can set the conditions.
Yeah.
That to me is what I would expect the military to do here. And frankly, that is consistent with what we've done for the last several administrations. You remember the Obama administration took us down to 30,000 or so based on the threat assessment and what was needed. We ramped back up again after that. And I think that's the way this will play.
And Kurt, I would have said the same thing, because you're right. Being a traditionalist myself, I would have. That's how you go about doing things. But I think in this case, with this administration, I I think it's going to, I always have to try to make myself think inside out in terms of trying to predict something. It's not what I think is going to happen, it's the inside out of that. And so I'm thinking that the global posture review in terms of Europe is he's going to want to make a statement there by pulling a chunk of troops out. Whether it's the rotational troops or it's the Biden plus up that went in, which were rotational. I mean, I think he wants to make a point about the Europeans doing more, and this belongs to you. And while he's saying nicer things about NATO, at least at the end of the summit a couple of months ago, I think he's gonna talk about them doing more, and to help them along the way, he's gonna pull these guys out right now. And so I think it's going to be a little bit of theater involved in the decision making for pulling those troops out. That's my thing.
And to some extent, this is reasonable, right? Because the Trump administration narrative can say, look, just several months ago at the NATO summit in The Hague,
Yeah,
allies agreed to take more of the burden. And based on that, it's only reasonable that we take less of the burden.
yeah. We're
Now,
so happy. We're so
the 5%,
happy to be able to pull these troops out. Thank you all so much. That was a
right.
wonderful summit. We're
And of
out of
course, the 5% defense pledge is over 10 years. And, but all that can get
here. Right.
lost in the storyline.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the hope is, Kurt, I hope, Kurt, that you're closest to the truth. And I hope that this administration recognizes that, the reduction does have to be over time in a highly choreographed manner, where Europe has the time and space to build up the capabilities that we're slowly withdrawing. But I don't know. We were talking before we started the podcast. I think, just given the context that you all have described in the US, my working assumption is just that things will be worse than I expect. And that's kind of where I am, mentally.
Well, Kurt, ably describes sort of the National War College approach to, defense planning. There aren't many National War College graduates populating this administration. So we can hope that he's right, but I don't know. Much beyond hope is a stretch.
Yeah, I'll give you an example that gives me hope.
Brittany, end up
Please,
a positive note, Kurt.
please,
Okay,
please.
here's the positive note. So, look, we know in this administration there is one person, President Trump. Everyone else is there to implement what President Trump decides. There is no National Security Council. There is no set of advisors. There's no value on expertise. It is President Trump calling the shots. That's what this administration is. And that means that things that rise to his level of attention are purely his personal decision. It goes this way or that way based on what President Trump says. Most of things in the world still take place at a level below President Trump. And where those things occur, for example, working with Ukraine on intelligence sharing and systems integration, that has been uninterrupted during the Trump administration. It is not something on President Trump's radar to get deep into the weeds of that. And our people who are in Ramstein or in Stuttgart or wherever they may be, are doing the jobs that they know how to do, and they have authority to do it. And those things are moving normally. And so that's the reason I have some optimism about the defense strategy and a force posture review, is that this will have been tasked to people who know what they're doing, and they will lay out a pathway. It may get, as Doug is suggesting, or as Jim is suggesting, a political gloss to say, we're going to reduce our presence by X amount and our allies are going to do more. Okay, but let's look under the hood there. What's that really going to look like? I suspect it's going to be a lot more continuity than abrupt change.
Kurt, I hope you're right. I don't know if I share your optimism, because flip side of the coin is there are people who kind of want to, please the czar, think they understand the direction of travel, and therefore, try to do things that they think that Mr. President will like. And there are people, especially on the Ukraine file, who are, I think, slowing down deliveries, intentionally dragging their feet, putting what's the saying, throwing rocks in the gears, or whatever the saying is, who are making things difficult. So I hope you're right, but I just
think
ruined
some of
the
those
optimistic
people-
note.
I think some of those people who think they are doing things that will please the czar have actually ended up pissing off the czar.
Bridge
Well,
Cole.
that's because the czar constantly
Right.
changes his mind,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, he's a little hard to follow.
Well, that's good. That's because he's the czar. He can do that.
So,
Yeah.
Andrea, the good news is there's plenty of ammunition here for follow-on podcasts.
That's the good news. And we will definitely take you up on that and have you back for sure.
Great to see you guys.
Good to
Thanks.
see you. Thanks for joining.
Yeah.
Great discussion.
Thank you. Be
Thanks.
safe, Kurt.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.